Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Grant Avers. Hello, Professor Havers. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine, Lipton. Good to be here.
I'm great. I'm elated to speak to you, Professor. This question may be a bit complicated, but for some time now we have been debating the founding of the American Republic. Who really influenced the founding fathers?
That is a big question. I would say there are two influences. One is the Enlightenment, that which of course is the great intellectual movement of modernity, which really defines what modernity is. So there's the Enlightenment, but there's also the Protestant Reformation, which helped to define the American founding and especially the theological or religious features of that founding.
And Grant, did John Locke really have a major influence on the founding?
Well, I think he did. Several founders read Locke. I think it's hard to understand the American founding, especially the commitment to natural rights republicanism, without taking into account Locke's influence. I don't think Locke was the only influence, and I think that influence has often been misunderstood. But yeah, I think the element of natural rights republicanism, which is central to the founding, comes right out of Locke's philosophy.
And today it is becoming fashionable to argue that Lockean liberalism can lead to nihilism. Is this true?
Well, I think that would surprise Locke. It certainly wasn't his intention to encourage nihilism. That word didn't even exist in Locke's time. But I think the argument, which often comes from the right today, is that Locke, whether he knew it or not, encouraged a philosophy that would contribute to thoughtless hedonism in the long term, which would further erode important restraints and institutions that keep a republic together. My own view, in brief, is that Locke counted on some version of Protestant Christianity to be the moral underpinning of his natural rights philosophy. Now, whether he was naive to think that Protestant Christianity could survive the implications of his own philosophy is another question, but I think he counted on that. And the same could be said about Hobbes and Spinoza, who of course are very important to early modern philosophy. I think they counted on some version of Protestant or bourgeois Christianity to be the moral glue or foundation to their politics.
Spinoza is an interesting and often misunderstood character. Tell us a little about Spinoza.
Well, Spinoza was of Portuguese Jewish ancestry, but he lived in Holland all his life, from 1632 to 1677. Spinoza is important because he's really the first defender of modern democracy, at least in a philosophical sense. His work, the Theological Political Treatise, is the text in which he defends democracy, but he also defends democracy on biblical grounds. Sometimes this is misunderstood by most readers of Spinoza, who think that he's simply a secular thinker. I think at best that's a half truth. If secular means anti-religious, that doesn't apply to Spinoza. Spinoza thought that it was the Hebrew covenant, not Periclean Athens, that was the true foundation of democracy. And based on that argument, Spinoza further argued that this democracy needed a strong biblical morality in order to maintain its stability, but also its freedom. So I think Spinoza is very important here.
I agree with you, but originally we weren't planning to discuss Jerusalem and its contribution to democracy, but many scholars have argued that the covenant theology is a representative of Judeo-Christian heritage and its contribution to the West, in the sense that the God of the Bible is more democratic than gods of other religions.
Oh, I certainly would agree with that. It's hard to understand Western civilization, especially medieval and modern civilization, without taking into account the Bible, without taking into account Christianity in particular, although the Hebrew covenant is very important as well. And in fact, I would go further and say that it's hard to understand the Enlightenment, despite its radical atheistic features. It's hard to understand the Enlightenment apart from its indebtedness to the biblical tradition. And Spinoza is a good example of that. He's an Enlightenment philosopher, but he's also very committed to a biblical truth or a biblical foundation for politics.
Was Spinoza an atheist?
Well, it depends on what we mean by atheism. I mean, usually he accused his opponents of atheism because, in his view, they made misuse of religious language to justify tyranny. So Spinoza, in the Theological Political Treatise, argues that the real atheists are those who blaspheme in the name of God or who justify tyranny in the name of God. They are the ones who are betraying the spirit of God and the spirit of the covenant. So people who act uncharitably, people who violate what Spinoza thought was the essence of the Bible, love thy neighbors and would love God. People who don't believe in that or who violate that principle, they're the real atheists. So I think in Spinoza's view, he saw himself as the true believer in God, and his opponents were the atheists.
And do we misinterpret Spinoza when we argue that he viewed God as an expression of the universe?
Yeah, that's the usual charge of pantheism, which Spinoza himself rejected. I don't think he was a pantheist, but he sometimes, I suppose, he gave that impression by arguing that God is everywhere. I think what he meant by that is that it's hard to understand anything, especially human existence, apart from God. Which is not to say that everything we do expresses God, because of course there were plenty of people in Spinoza's time who justified tyranny and slavery in the name of God. Spinoza, of course, thought that they were not properly manifesting the Spirit of God.
All right. And because we're on the topic of Spinoza and John Locke, I must mention that Locke could have been influenced by the church fathers because he was taught by individuals who more than likely would have been familiar with early Christian theology. And the concept of religious freedom, liberal equality, etc., emerged in Christianity to an extent. So are we overrating the role of Christianity in the founding when we contend that the founding is based on Judeo-Christian heritage?
Well, I think Locke, who was heavily influenced by Spinoza, uh, believed that if charity is the most important truth that the Bible reveals, that we need to come up with a kind of politics that is based on charity. So I think Locke did this quite effectively in his famous work, A Letter Concerning Toleration, which came out in 1689 or 1690. Locke argued in so many words that if we really take charity seriously as good Christians, then we have to support freedom of thought, freedom of conscience. We have to oppose theocracy, which integrates church authority with state authority. I suppose today this would be called the beginning of liberal Christianity. But I think Locke, like Spinoza, believed that true charity requires not theocracy, where the church is essentially the government, but a freer or more liberal climate of opinion in which there is religious freedom as well as philosophical freedom. So I think that Locke and Spinoza's argument in brief was that everybody values their freedom. And if I take away your freedom, then I'm essentially violating charity or the golden rule. I'm not treating you the way I would want to be treated. So it must follow, in accord with charity, that there should be freedom of thought for everyone.
All right. And did Locke believe that secular morality could replace religious morality?
No, that's not the way I read Locke, and that's not the way I read Spinoza either. I think they believed, as did Thomas Jefferson, that the Bible had revealed the greatest standard of morality conceivable to human beings, namely charity, that in fact nobody can improve on that morality or ethic. So if we're going to be good Christians, then we have to uphold that ethic of charity as much as possible.
Okay, then, and I agree with you. This is also my reading of Locke. But another contention is the role of democratic ideals in the shaping of America. Were the founding fathers skeptical of democracy?
Yes, they were reluctant to use that term democracy. Of course, the term republic was a more favored term. Whenever the founders, here I'm thinking of Hamilton in particular, refer to democracy, they have in mind ancient democracy or Greek and Roman democracy, which basically crashed and burned in ancient history. Greek democracy did not survive civil war or civil conflict, and the same goes for the Roman Republic. So the two great ancient experiments in democracy were absolute failures. And so for that reason, Hamilton, I think it's Article 9 of the Federalist, warns that the new American Republic should not look to the Greeks and Romans as role models, that in fact, America needs to come up with a different type of democracy that will avoid civil strife and civil war. And of course, Hamilton thought that institutionalizing checks and balances would be one way of preventing the kind of conflicts that dogged Greek and Roman democracy. So democracy was not Hamilton's preferred term. He preferred republicanism instead.
And what is the difference between a democracy and a republic?
I think the difference in the context of the Federalist and what Hamilton thought was that Greek and Roman democracy was defined as the tyranny of the majority. It wasn't a literal majority, though, because people who were not citizens were not allowed to participate in Greek and Roman democracy. But it was a majority in the sense that a majority of legal citizens would call the shots. But there were no restraints on the power of the majority. The only way the majority or the multitude could be restrained is through violent civil war. So there is no institutionalized arrangement of checks and balances. So the genius of the American founding is that it was understood from the beginning that there have to be checks and balances on what the people can do and what they cannot do. So the last thing the American founders wanted was a tyranny of the majority, because if that were to happen, then they wouldn't be improving upon the Greek and Roman versions of democracy. So a republic has checks and balances, but ancient Greek and Roman democracy did not.
And Grant, please tell us, what did the founding fathers acquire from the Greeks in terms of political philosophy, and then we'll talk about the Romans.
Well, my own view is that the founders did not rely heavily on Greek and Roman authors, except in terms of learning things that they needed to avoid. So they were like negative lessons on what not to do. So if I read Hamilton correctly, he wanted to avoid the failures of Greek and Roman democracy. And in fact, he worried that the opponents of American republicanism would use, and in fact did use, the examples of Greek and Roman democracy as an argument against the creation of the American Republic. So in Hamilton's view, one needed to create institutions that would respect checks and balances, which in fact were absent in Greek and Roman history. And that's why Greek and Roman democracy never actually survived.
Thanks. And another popular argument that's often fashioned in public discourse is that the founding fathers admired the liberty of the Roman Empire. Is this true?
Well, I think some founders read Machiavelli and perhaps agreed to some extent with Machiavelli's portrait of the Romans as lovers of liberty. But even Machiavelli had to admit that this Roman love of liberty did not prevent civil war, because liberty from a Greek or Roman point of view meant liberty for just one group of people, not for everybody, but for one group of people. So what Hegel calls universal freedom, as in freedom for all people, was absent in the Greek and Roman mindset. And I hope this isn't too much of a tangent, but of course Hegel famously argues that in Eastern or Oriental civilization, only one person was free, i.e. the one ruler. In the Greco-Roman world, only the few were free, i.e. the master class. But in the Christian world, you have everyone enjoying freedom, I think largely because of biblical morality. I mean, that's a bit of a tangent, but I think in a way, the more astute founders who had not read Hegel nevertheless understood that ancient Greeks and Romans had a concept of freedom, but it was a pretty limited concept of freedom. Freedom referred to the freedom of a ruling class that would dominate other people within the Greek or Roman democracy.
But why were the founding fathers interested in freedom in the first place?
Well, I think one reason is because they believed that freedom had been denied them by the British Empire that governed the colonies just before the American Revolution. So in their view, they saw themselves as Englishmen, but they also felt that they didn't have the same rights or freedoms that Englishmen had in England itself. So there was a massive contradiction here. If they were in fact true Englishmen, then why on earth were they denied basic freedoms, both intellectual and economic?
And Grant, what is so special about the founding of America? I've often argued that America was started as a modern country, whereas the French and the British evolved to become modern, but the founding of America was essentially modern.
Well, I think that's true. America is the first modern republic in history. And I think it's also the first political regime that enshrines, albeit imperfectly, the principle of equality before the law. That in fact we are all equal before the law. There shouldn't be any unequal treatment for one group of people or at the expense of another group of people. So certainly the principle of equality before the law precedes the American founding, but the American founding actually put into practice that principle. And I think it is original for that reason, but it's also original for the reason regarding checks and balances. It was really the first regime in history whose founders were determined to put restraints on what the government and the people could do, so as to avoid the tyranny of the majority that plagued Greek and Roman democracy.
It appears that the founding fathers discovered a near perfect synthesis of secular philosophy and Christian philosophy.
Yes, I think so. I think they did their best to synthesize the Enlightenment, the philosophy of the Enlightenment, as in Locke and to some extent Spinoza, with the Reformation, with Protestant traditions, and out of that synthesis came their understanding that human beings are not angels. Human beings have frailties. The abuse of power is desired by many human beings, or at least that's a temptation that many human beings have. So I think they brought together the Protestant and Enlightenment view that because human beings are far from perfect, there must be a government that takes that into account and therefore imposes restraints on what rulers can do and what the people can do as well.
And the view of founding exposed by the founding fathers is consonant with the foreign policy of freedom. America's founding fathers did not envision for the republic to become a global empire, but somewhere along the line, unfortunately, it did. Why did they espouse this belief? Why were they so averse to America becoming an empire?
Well, I think one reason is that they didn't want to follow in the footsteps of Greek and Roman imperialists, who in fact destroyed their own democracies, not just through civil war, but through imperial expansionism. And at the same time, the founders did not want to go the way of the British Empire or the French Empire, which in fact was destroyed through imperial expansionism as well. And of course, that led to the French Revolution. So from an 18th century American perspective, or early 19th century American perspective, empires were bad things. Empires would corrupt the virtues that are necessary to maintain a republic or constitutional government.
Neither were the founding fathers internationalists.
That's right. I don't think they were necessarily cosmopolitan in their understanding of human culture. I think they believed that Western civilization was the greatest achievement that human history had revealed. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to argue that they were xenophobes who believed that only a certain ethnicity could understand or put into practice constitutional government. I mean, most founders wanted slavery to end. They looked forward to the end of slavery, and in fact thought that slavery would end of its own accord. Of course, they were wrong about that. But I think within the minds of the founders, there is a combination of appreciation for historical particularity, but also some appreciation for moral universalism, which comes out of their indebtedness to biblical morality.
Well, one could argue that the founders were not xenophobic because they were against internationalism. And if one appreciates the utility of all cultures, then you will not intervene in the business of foreign peoples.
That's right. And yeah, you put that very well. And I think that explains why there's always been a kind of anti-imperialist strain in American political thought, which is not to deny that there's also been an imperialist strain as well. But I think the founders believed generally that a republic that embarks upon imperialism and expansionism is going to crash and burn, just like the democracies of Athens and the Roman Republic.
And the founding fathers were also quite conservative in they perceive the role of government in the economy. Why do we understand their liberal economic policies? And I'm referring to liberal in the British sense, not the American sense.
Yeah, I think again, this goes back to the Lockean view that uh, an economic system, that is to say capitalism, based on the pursuit and cultivation of property rights is good for the general welfare. That in fact, that type of system benefits at least the majority of people in a given society. By the same token, though, founders like Hamilton were not averse to mercantilism or to using certain statist interventions to bolster the economy. Hamilton wanted a national bank, for example. So there was a lot of debate during the time of the founding over economic interventionism. The Hamiltonians wanted more of it. Of course, the Jeffersonians wanted very little of it. So at least in early colonial or early Republican America, say the early 19th century, there were protectionist measures intended to shore up infant industries. So America, I think, never pursued a Simon Pure version of free market capitalism, but generally leaned in that direction.
And protectionism often resulted in rent seeking and enriching crony capitalists.
Yeah, I think that's true. And certainly by the time of the Civil War, protectionism and kind of an American version of mercantilism were in full force, partly because the northern capitalists who of course supported Lincoln during the Civil War also pushed for more protectionism against industries from the British Empire, in the belief that that would create a stronger America, or turn America into more of a player on the global stage.
Quite fascinating points. But Avert, I'm particularly intrigued by how the founding fathers perceived religion, because it is apparent that they viewed secularism in a different lens from us.
Right. Well, they certainly didn't want an established church of the sort that you had in Britain or European nations as a whole. So they certainly wanted religious freedom, but religious freedom was not the same thing as freedom from religion altogether. So I think the American political scientist Wilmore Kendall put it best, that there was a wall between church and state, but that wall was porous. In other words, the wall was not a kind of rigid literal separation of church and state. So I think the founders generally assumed that America would always have a kind of Christian character, broadly speaking. And that didn't require the establishment of an official church, which few Americans wanted anyway. But it did require, in a way, perhaps the unwritten assumption or implicit assumption that the majority of Americans would continue to be Christian in terms of their morality, and that would provide a sufficient foundation for virtue and ordered liberty in the new America. In other words, I don't think they ever really anticipated different religions competing with each other for hegemony within the United States, nor did they assume that a majority of Americans would just turn away from religious belief and become full-blown atheists. I don't think that was what they had in mind.
Grant, do you know why Americans are so religious?
Well, I suppose it goes back to all the way back to their history, including their pre-revolutionary history. I think there's always been a belief ever since the Mayflower Compact that Americans are a chosen people, or to put it in Lincoln's more cautious terms, an almost chosen people. So the belief that America is a new nation is hand in hand with the assumption that Americans are also a chosen people, chosen by God to do great things in history. And I think there are good sides and bad sides to that theology of chosenness. Chosenness, of course, can inspire decency and charity, but it can also inspire imperialism and expansionism or manifest destiny. But I think one has to understand the theology of chosenness is still being quite central to the American experience. And the irony is that even Americans who consider themselves secular often adhere to that theology of chosenness, whether they know it or not.
Interesting analysis, but Grant, the answer is that America did not have a state church. So the absence of a state church facilitated competition. With a monopoly, the major church would have grown lazy. And a lazy church does not engage in rampant evangelism.
Yeah, so I think Tocqueville noticed that in his famous travels to the United States in the 1820s or 1830s. Tocqueville noted that, of course, religious freedom inspires the growth of religion, which he thought was an impressive feature of American history. Whereas imposing a state church on people actually provokes resentment, as in the case of European nations and to some extent Britain. So allowing religious freedom, at least for a time, encouraged the growth of religious belief rather than some atheistic backlash.
Exactly my point. So had it not been for a free market in religion, maybe Americans would have been like Europeans.
Yeah, I think that's true. And to invoke a parallel point, a state church, of course, raises questions about class hierarchy and institutionalized inequality. None of that became a problem in the American experience because, of course, in the absence of a state church, one doesn't have to worry about the powerful influence of a hierarchy that tries to integrate church authority with secular authority.
Since you mentioned Tocqueville, why did early America display such a strong sense of community and trust?
Well, in the early 19th century, something called the Second Great Awakening occurred in the United States, which basically was a huge resurgence or revival of Protestant Christianity, which at the time was necessary to provide some kind of moral or existential stability to an America that was rapidly changing, that was starting to industrialize and gradually becoming a less rural nation. So amidst all these changes, the Second Great Awakening was important because it provided a sense of America's place in the providential design of the universe. Now, of course, not all Americans were comfortable with this. Thomas Jefferson, towards the end of his life, lamented the fact that America was becoming more obviously Christian. He hoped that America would be Unitarian, which of course he adopted as a philosophy. He thought that Unitarianism should become the unwritten kind of religion of the United States, but it didn't work out that way because of the Second Great Awakening.
And what is Unitarianism for those of us who are not familiar with the concept?
Well, Unitarianism downplays all theological differences between the major religions in favor of emphasizing that there is one unifying morality, essentially the golden rule, which brings all religions together. So in practice, a Unitarian doesn't have to adhere to any particular religion. All they have to do is adhere to the golden rule or to basic morality and leave it at that. So I suppose in a way that attracted Jefferson or inspired him to write or compose his own version of the Bible. Sometimes this is called the Jefferson Bible, which emphasizes the morality of the New Testament, but takes away all references to miracles and other more supernatural features of God's existence. So that's what Unitarianism is. Just be a moral person and don't worry about differences between other religions.
Jefferson is such an interesting character. On one hand, he advocated liberalism and equality, but he also believed in what some call a meritocracy of talent.
Well, that's right. And I think he's in sync with other founders who believed that, sure, we should have equality before the law, but that doesn't mean that we're all going to be equally talented or that we'll all have the same talents. I think generally the American founders believe that most people have at least one talent, but there is a kind of inequality of talents. Not everyone can be a business person. Not everyone can be an engineer. Some people are more suited to philosophy than others. So people have different talents, and it's important for an economic system to cultivate those talents, but the results are often unequal, but that's okay. So there's nothing wrong with having a kind of a meritocracy because that's the price of freedom. A free society may lead to unequal results in terms of achievement, but there's nothing wrong with that.
Some would argue that a meritocracy of talent can morph into an aristocracy. Actually, many share this belief, and they are contending that meritocracy is actually elitist and it is leading to aristocracy, especially because educated men are marrying educated women.
Yeah, I think that's a danger, although I suppose the libertarian within me would respond that the only time when an aristocracy might emerge from a meritocracy is when the state makes that possible. So if the state, the government, interferes on behalf of a group of people who feel themselves to be superior and gives them privileges that no one else has, then in fact you'll have an aristocracy. But the free market itself does not create an aristocracy as long as you have conditions of competition that would stop the state from favoring arbitrarily a certain group of people at the expense of other people.
For example, 80% of America's millionaires are first generation millionaire, according to one Cato researcher. But before Cato did the study, I was familiar with that concept because many writers who study millionaires often argue that most millionaires in America are first generation millionaires. The American economic system is quite dynamic. And as you rightly said, the only way an aristocracy can emerge is if the government decides to create one.
Yeah, and that danger has often emerged in American history. I think Murray Rothbard did a wonderful job of showing how there have always been corporate interests in the history of America who don't want to compete in the free market system, who want privileges and subsidies and protectionism that will shore up their own interests at the expense of others. So that danger has always existed, and of course, political parties, both Republican and Democrat, have committed themselves to crony capitalism, to use your term. So there's always been that danger, but that of course cannot be blamed on the operation of the market system, because if you let the market do its thing, it will create new wealth and will be able to undermine established privilege that has been sanctioned by the state.
Exactly. And recent research, I believe, was done in around 2021, also argues that for England, the super rich people in that class are first generation affluent people. The term million, I don't remember if the term millionaire was used, but the researcher was collating data across several generations, and he arrived at a similar conclusion.
Right. I suppose that countries with a feudal heritage, i.e. Europe or Britain, find it ideologically easy to use the state to prop up established privilege. But that's a very un-American idea.
But even
Because
in those societies, social mobility is still evident.
that's true. As those nations became more capitalistic or more open to the market, the operations of the market, yes, the privilege was undermined. Having said that, though, I mean that there is a history of statism in these nations that I think can be traced back to a feudal heritage too. But America, of course, was born a bourgeois capitalist nation without any type of feudal heritage, and that's why any idea of the state propping up privilege in an artificial sense is usually unpopular and un-American.
And then now, Grant, we're going to talk about your article, The Flawed Attempt to Make a Religion for the Right. What is this piece about for our listeners, because I already read it?
Well, this article is about the Claremont Institute, which is a voice on the American right that in principle calls for the restoration of the original principles that animated the American founding. Nothing wrong with that. But the intellectual founder of the Claremont Institute, Harry Jaffa,
Jaffa.
yeah, who was a famous political philosopher, died in 2015, argued that America needs a political religion. So it's not enough to adhere to basic constitutional principles. I don't think anybody on the right would dispute that. But Jaffa believed that in order for America to survive and flourish, it needed a political religion. He took this term from a speech given by a young Abraham Lincoln. It's known as the Lyceum speech that Lincoln gave as a young man in 1829, in which Lincoln was horrified by the wave of violence and lawlessness that was sweeping the republic at the time. So Lincoln was calling for Americans to adhere to the rule of law. Well, there's nothing controversial about that. Lincoln just added that this adherence to the rule of law should become a political religion. So again, that doesn't sound too frightening. But Jaffa, who became a very famous Lincoln scholar, he wrote a 2-volume study of Lincoln's political philosophy, argued that it is America's mission in the world, its messianic mission. So now we're back to chosenness. It's America's mission in the world to export its ideals all over the world, its democratic ideals, that is, and to indoctrinate its own people in believing this mission, that in fact the ideals of America are also the ideals of the world. And for America to survive and for the world to survive in freedom, these ideals have to be exported. So that's what he meant by a political religion. And any American who questions that is a reprobate in the mindset of Professor Jaffa. So in my own perhaps jaded view, this idea of a political religion has nothing to do with American conservatism. It has nothing to do with the American founding. It's kind of a transplanted assumption that has been that was imposed by Harry Jaffa on the American conservative tradition. And I think the practical result of a political religion is imperialism. To spread ideals, you usually have to use force to make sure those ideals are influential.
Irving Babbitt would not have appreciated Jaffa if he had lived longer.
No, I think that's true. And I think generally the American founders probably would have been horrified by that idea that America needs a political religion in order to perpetuate its existence. And in fairness to Lincoln, I don't think he had ambitions of that kind. He was, of course, facing civil war during his presidency, and he despite certain rhetorical gestures on his part towards the universal nature of American ideals, I don't think he ever believed that America should aggressively export its ideals all over the world. So I think Jaffa was reinventing Lincoln as well.
But I must admit, I like the Claremont Institute. Some of its writers are really exceptional.
Yeah, my guess is, Lipton, that you're referring to recent writings.
Yeah,
By
recent
Claremont
writers like
authors.
Angelo, well, he's pretty old, but Angelo Codivilla,
Yes,
yeah,
and
he's
Michael
good.
Anton. Yeah, yeah. I think the Claremont Institute has changed. For one thing, they sound more isolationist than they did in the time of Harry Jaffa. And of course, they have been very enthusiastic in their support of Trump, who, whatever you think about his presidency, it certainly wasn't, he certainly didn't advance an imperialistic foreign policy. He never got America involved in new wars. So I think the failures to build democracy in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya have all chastened the mindset of Claremont people who now almost sound like the old right in terms of scaling back on American interventionism around the world. So I think the Claremont Institute has changed, but I think at their core is still this idea of political religion that their intellectual founder promulgated.
And the Claremont Institute, based on the writings of others and yourself, seem to take the concept of equality seriously. But I'm betting that obviously Emmy Bradford disagreed when he was alive, and if he were alive today, he would still disagree. But how central is the notion of equality to the founding?
Well, I think it's central in the sense that of course, the Declaration of Independence made the principle of equality central. Of course, it depends on what one means by equality. I would think generally there shouldn't be any disagreement over the principle of equality before the law. The real question is how far equality should go. Should equality be a principle that must be exported to the rest of the world in order to shore up American democracy. I think that's what worried certain traditional conservatives about Jaffa. If Jaffa had just been saying, look, we need to have equality before the law, that would not have been a very controversial view. But Jaffa wanted to turn this principle into a political religion that would become a pretext for an aggressive foreign policy. So I think that's what worried conservatives like Wilmore Kendall, who wondered, well, what are the limits of this kind of egalitarian imperialism? Should America be imposing a natural rights philosophy on the rest of the world without its consent? So I think that this whole debate over political religion really shows an important division within the history of the American right and how to interpret equality within the context of the founding.
But I think the main contention is the argument that all men are equal. Clearly, under the law, we're equal, but not in terms of talent or abilities. I think this is where some conservatives draw the line.
That's right. And in fairness to Jaffa and the Claremont Institute, they don't object to an inequality of talent any more than Aristotle did or other great philosophers. So they don't believe that equality is the same as egalitarian leveling, as in the case of the French Revolution. But I think the danger is that if one upholds equality as the preeminent principle of the American founding, which is what Jaffa did, that raised the question, well, how far should this go? I mean, certainly they have their own understanding of limits. They believe that equality should be limited, but I guess what worries me and other conservatives is that people on the left have no interest in adhering to those limits. So once you set up equality as a preeminent principle, what's to stop people on the left from advocating an unlimited idea of equality, which has no sympathy with tolerating inequality in terms of talent?
The late ex-scholar Eric von Ledin actually said that equality is not even evident in heaven.
Perhaps
Yeah.
not. Maybe he had some knowledge that I don't, but
Yes, and there are some contemporary writers who share this view that Christians will not be rewarded equally.
Well, that's right, and that idea is hardly alien to the history of America. I mean, when John Winthrop referred to a city on a hill as the embodiment of his understanding of Christian authority. I mean, on the one hand, Winthrop thought that, of course, we're all equal in the sense that we're obligated to practice charity or love thy neighbor, so there shouldn't be any inequality there. On the other hand, Winthrop was quite tolerant of an unequal distribution of wealth and privilege within his understanding of Christian authority. So certainly equality before the law does not contradict inequality in terms of results. And I think the Claremont Institute certainly believes that. But again, if one believes that equality is the be all and end all of politics, then who's to say that there should be any limits on equality?
I think that Eric von Ledin is a thinker who should be rediscovered. I don't know if you are a fan or if you read him a lot, but I do enjoy his work.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read some of his work, but yeah, generally I sympathize with the idea that equality is a good thing, but there are also other principles that are good as well, such as liberty. And I think a wise constitutional government will try to strike a balance between equality and liberty, and pursue these goods in tandem with each other, but not to give too much power to the principle of equality that can end up swamping the domain of liberty. I think Tocqueville worried about that if despotism ever came to America, it would be a kind of egalitarian bureaucratic despotism, which would eliminate liberty.
Do you share the assumption of some on the old right that the right is naturally aristocratic in terms of its outlook?
Well, I think there's always been a strong aristocratic element to some strains of American conservatism, or conservatism as a whole. Um, I would think that aristocracy in the feudal sense doesn't have many defenders today, perhaps not even in Europe anymore, because feudal privilege was basically made obsolete by the rise of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. But if aristocracy means that we should have the freedom to achieve unequal results and not feel guilty about it, then I think indeed, yes, conservatism does endorse that version of aristocracy, but it can't be an aristocracy that is artificially imposed by the state or some coercive authority.
And this aristocracy is also bourgeois in its preference for art and architecture. There's a high value on beauty and aesthetics.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's based on the assumption that some people are just more creative than others, and instead of bemoaning that or trying to suppress it or dismissing it as the genetic lottery, to use John Rawls's term, one should recognize that that kind of inequality of talent actually contributes to the greatest good of the greatest number, to use a utilitarian slogan. And imposing an artificial equality is unfair to people who have more talents than others in certain fields. So I would think from a utilitarian point of view, there's nothing wrong with cultivating that kind of inequality.
Grant, in your an exploration of the Claremont Institute, well, I didn't ask, but you didn't mention Leo Strauss. Who was Leo Strauss?
Well, Leo Strauss was a German Jewish political philosopher who grew up during the Weimar Republic in 1920s to early 1930s Germany, and then fled just before Hitler took power. And Strauss actually fled Germany in 1932, and eventually made his way to the United States and became a very important and influential political philosopher. He taught for many years at the University of Chicago, and out of that experience, created a whole new school of thought known as the philosophy of natural right, that has had enormous influence on American conservative thought. I mean, it's not that he invented the term natural right, but I think before he came to America, there actually wasn't much discussion of the philosophical implications of the natural right tradition, which is surprising in and of itself. But anyway, one of Strauss's students was Harry Jaffa. And Jaffa and the Claremont Institute generally give the impression that they're teaching Strauss's philosophy as he would want it to be taught, vis-a-vis the conservative tradition.
All right. And briefly, what are some of the consequences of his natural rights philosophy?
Well, there are different understandings of natural right. Strauss, in his book Natural Right and History, shows very persuasively that what the Greeks, especially Aristotle, understood to be natural right is very different from what John Locke understood to be natural right. In simple terms, Aristotle, of course, believed that that nature is the source of a great deal of inequality that can never be altered, really. Now, of course, Locke's understanding of natural right is far more egalitarian. I mean, he gives the impression if you work hard enough and you cultivate your property or acquire property in a legal and ethical manner, then there's nothing wrong with the results that come out of that. That in fact everyone should have the opportunity to cultivate their property rights in that sense. That was certainly not Aristotle's view. Aristotle believed that no system, certainly no economic system, can alter the natural inequality which is at the heart of human society. So Strauss was very good as an historian at bringing out those differences over what natural right means from one historic period to another.
Grant, I enjoyed our conversation, but these days I'm keeping the discussion short, no more than 1 hour. So it was a pleasure to speak to you, but bye. All right then.
Thank you, Lipton.
All right.